Who are you? Who are you? Who are you? Well, hello there. Come in, come in. Don't be afraid. Please sit down. Are you cold? Here, take this. No, please, please don't leave. Stay with me just a little while longer. I want to tell you a story. A story about a young woman who lived in a village many years ago. She had a name, a beautiful name. Amara. 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 That's my name. Now, do you know what her story is? No, don't go. Please stay. You must hear it. You see, Amara loved someone. They say that she loved like a creature of the night, intensely, passionately, hopelessly. The kind of love that does not relinquish even in death. Oh, you think that's crazy. But when I tell you her tale, you will understand that there is nothing more powerful than such a love. Amara's lover died one winter night. They say he simply froze in his sleep. The young man, a victim of the cruel winter that bit deep into the bones and did not spare even the spring of youth. And so, for 3 nights, a strange wind blew through the village, a wind that carried the scent of snow and death. On the 3rd night, it stopped, and when the sun rose, they found the young man dead in his bed, pale as the new fallen snow. When Amara heard the news, she was inconsolable. She tore at her hair, she beat her breast. She would not accept that he was dead. She did not eat for days. And then one day, she came up with a plan. She went to the old priest, Father Gabriel, and told him that she wanted to marry the dead. Of course, he refused. Such a thing was unheard of. To marry a corpse was an abomination. But Amara would not listen. She went to the river, took a clay pot, filled it with water from the river, placed it beside the dead man, lit a candle, and began to wait. All night she sat by the dead man's side and waited. By the next morning, the water in the pot had turned to blood. The priest, seeing this, understood that the girl's love knew no bounds, and so he agreed to marry them. Onlookers, can you imagine such a thing? A bride in white, all set to marry the dead. She wore black. That day, the whole village came out to watch this macabre wedding. Some were shocked, some amused, some thought it was madness. But Amara did not care. She went to the graveyard and married the dead man, not with words, for no priest would speak those words, but with a kiss. She kissed the dead man. And it is said that at that moment, the earth split open, and the dead man rose. Yes, you heard it right. He rose from the grave and Amara, and he disappeared into the forest. None saw them again. None, that is, except the old priest who saw them in his dreams. He saw them in his dreams every night. Amara and her dead lover, dancing in the forest, their laughter echoing in his ears. Do you know why I told you this story tonight? Well, let me tell you. Because tonight is the night when the veil between the worlds is at its thinnest. The veil between the living and the dead. The barrier between the real and the unreal. It is all one on this night. Do you feel that? Can you feel that? What do you feel? Tell me, is it cold? Is it freezing? That's how I feel. Just like Amara, I feel the touch of death, the bite of winter. Ah, but it's beautiful, isn't it? This nearness of death, this feeling that it is all so very close, so very near. It is thrilling, isn't it? It is terrifying, isn't it? But what if we could hold on to it? What if we could make death stay just a little longer? Whisper it, say it, say it, say it. Death, stay with me, just a little while longer. Death, stay with me, just a little while longer. Death, stay with me, just a little while longer. Death, stay with me, just a little while longer. Death, stay with me, just a little while longer. Ah, yes, whisper it, feel it. Let death linger just a little longer. Let it writhe and thrash and stay with us a little longer. Let us first visit the peasants, not the kings, not the aristocrats, but those whose lives were stitched together with toil and ritual, and a quiet fear of spirits left wandering. In the countryside of northern China, during the late Qing dynasty, there was a practice, hushed but not rare. It was called Minghun, the ghost marriage. When a son died unmarried, his spirit was thought to wander, restless, incomplete. The parents, poor and grieving, would search for another family, another house where a daughter had also died too young, and through matchmakers who specialized in the dead, 2 lifeless children would be wed. Paper effigies stood in their place, incense curled upward, food was offered, but never eaten, and the graves were joined as if 2 people had truly met. Why? Because a dead son without a wife meant dishonor. A wandering ghost could bring illness, misfortune, withhold fertility from the living, and so the poor spent what little they had. A few coins, a scrap of silk, sometimes the labor of a whole season, to ensure their son was not alone beneath the soil. It was not just China. In parts of Europe, quiet arrangements took place as well. In rural Bavaria, whispers spread of the Leichnermehe, the corpse marriage. There, a man who died suddenly before marriage might still be given a bride. A living girl, sometimes unwilling, was dressed in black lace and guided to the coffin. She would kneel, hands trembling, as vows were spoken for her. No kiss was given, no feast followed, only silence and the lingering shame of being bound to one who would never walk beside her. But let us now meet the dead, who wed for very different reasons. Meet Isabella. She lived in a world of silk and salt, of suitors and servants. Her father, the ruler of a small Italian state, had died when she was young. Her mother, determined that she would not follow him to the grave, doted on her surviving daughter, ensuring she was wed to a prince from a neighboring house. The groom Ferdinando had his own ambitions, but his path to power was paved with silk and gold. He agreed. The wedding was lavish. The finest silk for the bride, gold for the groom. The reception lasted days. A celebration not just of 2 lives entwined, but of an alliance forged between houses. Then came the night of nights, the consummation. Isabella was led to a bed, adorned with red velvet and gold. The groom awaited her, but he was not the man she knew, not entirely. As he stepped out of the shadows, she saw not her fiancé, but her father, come back from the grave to claim her hand. She screamed, stumbled back. Was it a ghost or a nightmare? The groom only smiled and leaned closer. "I am your father," he said, his voice echoing Isabella's worst fears. "You are mine." With that, he revealed a cruel twist of fate. They were wed, yes, but not in life. The groom was not a prince, but a pauper. The bride, a princess, had been sold. To pay off her father's debts, her mother had given her hand to the highest bidder. And now, on her wedding night, she realized she was not wed to a prince, but to ruin. What could she do? Who would listen to a bride's silent scream? In a world where a woman's value was measured in gold, where her body was bought and sold, Isabella was trapped. She had no choice but to submit. She had no voice. She was a pawn in a game of power and money. The groom, emboldened by her silence, took what he had paid for. What do these stories tell us? That death is not the end, at least not in the world of the living. For the dead, their status is secured. Their honor is maintained. Their needs are attended to, and their desires, however perverse, are fulfilled. We see the lengths to which people go to protect their dead. Minghun ensured a son did not roam as a lonely ghost. Leichnam allowed a maiden to fulfill her duty to her family, even in death. And Isabella, well, her story is a reminder that sometimes love and death play the cruelest of games. These are not just tales from the past. They are echoes in our present. They are threads in the complex fabric of human relationships. They are a reminder that the bonds of family, the ties of love, and the chill embrace of death intertwined in ways we may not always understand. Every night, rain or shine, he sat beside the tomb. Sometimes he read poetry. Sometimes he played a violin. Other times, he simply spoke, telling her stories of his life, his hopes, his adoration. All around him, the decades slipped by. The world changed. New medicines conquered tuberculosis. But Carl Tanzler remained, faithful to his dead love, hidden in the heart of Florida's twilight years. This is the story of my strange obsession. Now let me explain. It was only after he'd spent almost a decade beside the silent tomb that Carl Tanzler revealed his true identity, or what passed for one. Heinrich Hoffmann was born in Germany in the late 1800s. His father, a tanner of leather, died when he was still young. And then, as often happened in those days, he simply drifted away from home, leaving behind school, family, and all fixed purpose. At 18, he landed in New York City. Within months, he'd met and married a local girl. They settled in Key West, where Carl worked as a carpenter. But soon, his restless spirit was upon him again. He took up fortune-telling, which he claimed to have learned in India. Some people said he was good. Others called him a fraud. But whatever the truth, Carl was never satisfied. In the back of his mind, the vision of his mystical bride never faded. It flickered in the faces of strangers, beckoned from shop windows, dressed in silk. He always thought he recognized her, but she was always just out of reach. Then in 1927, he joined the staff of the Marine Hospital in Key West as a technician. It was here that he created machines and concocted treatments, a sort of quack medicine mixed with spiritualism. People came to him from all over the Caribbean. Some were rich, some were desperate, but all believed Carl Tanzler, the self-proclaimed doctor, held the secrets of healing, and it was among them that he found Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos. Now, like so many stories of obsession, there are two versions of what happened next. One is that Carl fell in love with Maria Elena as a patient. The other, and perhaps the crueler one, is that he saw in her only the chance to fulfill a lifelong dream. What is certain is that when Maria Elena died, he did not rest. Every night, he sat beside her tomb. And as the decades passed, the townspeople of Key West began to regard him as part of the landscape. In 1947, he finally emerged from the shadows. He told the local newspaper that he'd been sitting vigil beside the tomb for 16 years, and the reporter who interviewed him, along with everyone else, believed he was insane. So the story ended. Carl Tanzler was locked up in a mental hospital, where he spent his last years muttering about his visions and showing little interest in the outside world. He died in 1952. All this time, he'd talked about his bride, but now, when asked, he would say only that he'd never married. Then, as if realizing the truth of his situation, he would weep. That was the version of events printed in the newspapers. But sometimes, late at night, the orderlies heard him singing, not mournful songs, but lively waltzes and tangos. And some nights, beneath his window, they saw the ghost of a woman in a long white dress dancing alone. It is a tale as old as time, really. A man becomes obsessed with a woman, loses all sense of reality, sits for years on end by her tomb, and in the end is declared insane. But how many such stories have you heard with a happy ending? How many stories have you heard of men who danced with ghosts? And on that note, I will leave you for today, but please do come back and tell me which version you prefer, the sad one or the happy one. And night after night he visited, carrying flowers, whispering prayers, playing her favorite songs on a small organ. The guards grew used to his presence, a shadow beneath the moon, But grief did not contain him. Desire, refusal, obsession led him further. 2 years later, under the cover of darkness, Tanzler stole her body. He placed her carefully inside a toy wagon. He wheeled her through the silent streets to a house at the edge of town. There, behind closed curtains, his secret marriage began. The corpse decayed. The flesh softened, gave way, but he would not let her go. He replaced her skin with wax silk, her bones with wire, her face with glass eyes, her hair woven into wigs. He dressed her in wedding gowns. He placed her in his bed each night. Neighbors whispered that his windows never opened, that music drifted at odd hours, that he was never seen without flowers. But no one guessed the truth. For 7 years, 7 long years, Carl Tanzler lived with his bride of the dead. In 1940, the secret broke. Maria Elena's sister, suspicious, pressed the authorities. When they entered the house, they found her, a figure more doll than woman, preserved by devotion that was also desecration. Tanzler was arrested, but the court strangely could not punish him. The statute of limitations had expired, and in the newspapers, the people shockingly romanticized him. Some called it tragic love. Some called it madness. Few called it what it truly was, a violation of silence, of rest, of the dead. Afterward, Tanzler lived alone, painting portraits of Elena, building effigies of her form, whispering still of his eternal marriage. He died in 1952, found with a doll in his arms, a doll dressed as she once had been. This is the host, and if you like this kind of storytelling, check out my podcast, where I explore the hidden corners of history, bringing you tales that are stranger than fiction, from forbidden loves to chilling crimes. Each episode will keep you on the edge of your seat. We'll take you to places and times you've never seen or heard before. You'll meet people whose stories are so wild you won't believe they're true. Some say love can conquer all, but what if it's a love that shouldn't be? What if it's a love for the dead? This is the story of Carl Tanzler and his strange obsession. He was a man in love, deeply, madly in love with death. He didn't just love the idea of death. No, he loved the actual physicality of it, the touch of cold flesh, the feel of decaying matter. For Carl, death was not an end. It was a beginning of a twisted kind. When he first saw her, he knew he had to have her. Her name was Maria Elena, a beautiful young woman who had died of tuberculosis. Each night he would visit her grave, bringing flowers, playing his organ, singing her favorite songs. The priest turned a blind eye to his madness. After all, what harm was he causing? Just a man in love with his dead fiancée. But soon, Carl wanted more. He couldn't bear to part with her, not even in death. So he did something no man had ever done before. He dug up her corpse and took it home. He embalmed her, dressed her in a wedding gown, and made love to her. Night after night, he whispered sweet nothings in her dead ear, caressed her cold skin, and in his mind, they were married. The townspeople whispered about the strange man and his strange ways, but no one knew the half of it. They saw him walking in the streets with flowers, heard the music from his house at night, but they didn't know he was dancing with a corpse. Years went by, and the love between Carl and his dead bride only grew stronger. He kept her body from decaying, from turning to dust, and he kept himself from going insane. Or maybe he did go insane, but in a way that only love could make him. One day, Carl's secret came out. The neighbors who had gossiped about him for years now had enough. They went to the authorities and told them about the strange man and his even stranger ways. The police searched his house and found his dead bride. She was mummified, her body so well preserved that it was hard to believe she was dead. Carl was arrested and taken to court. but he was never punished. The judge said that since the body had been dead for so long, there was no statute of limitations on the crime, and so the man who had stolen a corpse and made love to it for years was set free. In the end, Carl died alone, his dead wife by his side. He was found in his bed, holding a doll that looks just like his dead bride. And that's the story of Carl Tanzler, the man who loved a dead woman so much that he kept her body from decaying and danced with her every night until his death. This is my corpse bride. This is my corpse groom. These are our children. Mine are the only voices in this room. Yours will be the only voices outside it. That's how our conversation might have started if I'd been speaking with peasants in 14th century Italy or a noble lady in Victorian England, because across cultures and centuries, our desires don't change much. We've always wanted to marry the dead. So here's a tour of history's strangest posthumous weddings. Part 2, where I tell you tales of the not so dearly departed. So when peasant girl Maddalena della Vite died suddenly in Florence in the year 1325, her family didn't just mourn her, they married her. Her father led her funeral procession, carrying a waxen effigy of her, sealed in a glass case. After she was laid to rest, he turned to the townspeople, gathered around and said, "Here lies my daughter. No one shall have her but God." He then retrieved the effigy from his bag and carried it back home. This macabre tableau became a common sight. Across Europe, citizens would attend funerals bearing banners, then return home with a wax doll meant to represent their loved one. These dolls were dressed in wedding attire, paraded through the streets, and then locked in rooms, sometimes for decades. But this bizarre practice wasn't limited to rural Italy or the dim oil lamp-lit parlours of Victorian London. It reached far beyond the veil, because in 1878, a member of the Russian imperial court also decided to marry a wax doll. Princess Yekaterina Romanova had grown up hearing fairy tales of her family's legendary status. When her mother died, she felt abandoned. Then her Aunt Elizabeth died, leaving behind a wax doppelganger made in her image. From that point forward, Yekaterina began to consider herself married to her waxen double, claiming that she heard her phantom voice, calling to her from another room. When her own face began to sag, she insisted that her servants dress her in the same clothing as the doll, even as doctors warned that the doll's airtight case was poisoning her mind. It took years of isolation, institutionalization, and multiple lobotomies to pry her away from the waxen figure and into reality. But her story proves that no matter our social standing, certain desires transcend our means. And while peasants might dream of marrying a handsome prince in effigy, some of us yearn to bind ourselves to those whose souls are still abroad, like dancer Helen Viola and her ghostly groom. Because when Helen met Anton in 1936, it was love at first sight. By all accounts, Anton was perfect, athletic, charming, and devoted. The two danced together every day until Anton enlisted to fight for the German army in 1939. And soon after he shipped out, he was gone. For 3 years, Helen waited. Then she received a letter informing her that her beloved had died in battle. Grieving, she returned to her village, where she fell gravely ill and died. Just days later, a farmer driving his tractor unearthed a skeleton wearing military uniform. Helen's family identified the bones as Anton's and arranged for him to be buried with full military honors, including a flag draped over his coffin. But as the villagers filed past to pay their respects, they noticed that Helen's casket was missing, and when they looked again, they found that the grave had been filled and smoothed over. No one knows what happened to Helen's body, but it's believed that she may have been buried with her lover, suggesting that in death, as in life, love conquers all. Some of history's most spectral unions come from the realm of celebrity. Because in 1842, when poet Alfred Lord Tennyson learned that his childhood friend and secret love, the Honourable Emily Selwood, had died, he was beside himself with grief. Tennyson had always thought of Emily as his soulmate, even though she was promised to another, and now that she was dead, he wanted to be near her, always. He purchased the slab of marble that covered her grave, then had it inscribed with a simple epitaph. Here lies the body of Emily Tennyson Selwood, beloved of Alfred Tennyson. But that wasn't enough. 4 years later, during renovations at his home, Tennyson discovered a hollow space under the drawing room floor. When he had it opened, police found a velvet-lined box inside. And when they opened it, they found Emily's favourite shawl, along with a lock of her hair. Was the great poet keeping these mementos of his lost love, or something more sinister? Sadly, we can't say. But one thing's for sure. Alfred wasn't the only famous fan of posthumous weddings, because when King Louis XIV of France entered the royal chapel on May 16, 1680, he was greeted by a shocking sight. His deceased wife, the Spanish Infanta Maria Teresa, was dressed in a magnificent gown and sitting in a chair as if waiting for him. Then her ladies-in-waiting entered, each cradling a bouquet of flowers. They approached the empty throne beside the dead queen and dropped the flowers onto it as a wedding gift. Finally, Louis himself sat down opposite his dead wife. A cardinal spoke a few words of ceremony, and then the king and queen were declared man and wife. The ceremony ended with the royal couple sharing a kiss, except the queen was very much dead. You see, Louis had ordered that his wife, his body be embalmed and dressed as a bride so that he could hold a grand wedding ceremony in her honour. But these weren't the only ghostly nuptials he'd attend. Over the next few decades, he married 3 other deceased women in similar ceremonies, including one to Marie Mancini, his niece and former mistress, who died aboard a ship bound for Canada. But perhaps no celebrity's post-mortem wedding was more scandalous than that of actor and sex symbol Rudolph Valentino, because when the star of the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse collapsed from a perforated ulcer in 1926, he was rushed to a hospital. But as he lay dying, fans crowded the halls and windows, begging to be let inside and touch their hero. Once he was dead, a crowd of women stormed the morgue, refusing to leave until they could view his body. They dressed him in black and carried him out into the street, where an estimated 100,000 mourners followed his hearse, blocking traffic and screaming until he was laid to rest. But some fans weren't willing to say goodbye. Actress and model Jean Acker, who had been engaged to Valentino when he died, showed up at the cemetery with a priest. The pair held a private ceremony in which they exchanged vows, and then she kissed his coffin before it was lowered into the ground. Sometimes, though, the line between loving remembrance and sinister obsession is razor thin, like in the case of Carl Tanzler, who died in 1929, believing that he was married to none other than Cuban beauty Maria LaGuardia. And no one in his hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, was shocked, because Carl Tanzler was obsessed with the dead. Ever since he moved to the States from Germany in 1903, he'd attended funerals instead of parties, saving newspaper clippings of obituaries and collecting photos of the deceased. His friends even joked that his real estate was haunted, since he'd begun digging tunnels under its foundation, leading directly to the local cemetery. Eventually, he fell in love with a patient he cared for, Mary Rigo, but when she died, he couldn't bear to part with her. He bribed the staff of the mortuary where she was being kept, stealing her body and hiding it in his home. For the next 7 years, he slept next to her corpse, professing his undying love. At night, he would rise to dance with the mummy, convinced that she was alive. Eventually, her body began to decay, and he stuffed the remains into a pillowcase and sewed it shut, continuing to dance with his beloved. When police searched his house, they found a collection of over 200 similarly preserved corpses, all carefully labeled with the name of the owner and the date of their demise. When asked why he kept the bodies, Tanzler replied, "I am a scientist. I do not kill, I preserve." And with that, he was committed to an insane asylum where he spent the rest of his life. As I said before, death doesn't end longing. For some, it deepens it, twists it, and turns grief into ritual or into transgression. In fact, many of us still marry the dead today. In 2016, for instance, Chinese police arrested men who dug up the corpses of young women to sell them for minghun, to be wed in death to men who had already passed. The trade in bodies hasn't vanished. It's just gone underground. And so our fantasies continue, because no matter our time or place, we want what we want. If your soulmate is gone, why should you stop loving them? Why should you stop dancing with them? Why should you stop bringing them flowers? Why shouldn't you keep them close? Why shouldn't you marry them? Why shouldn't you become their forever? In the afterlife, come back next week to explore the creepiest coincidences in history. See you then. They say your mind plays tricks when you're hungry. So we did what any reasonable people would do. We bought ourselves some food. Our editor, James, opted for the salad because apparently he's on a diet now. Our producer, Sammy, went for the cookies. And our writer, Rosie, well, she ate both the cookies and the salad. See, she's a growing girl. So after we'd eaten, we decided to open up our mailbag. And this week we have a question from a viewer. It goes, "When I was younger, I used to think it was weird that my family would always pray next to my grandpa's coffin when they went to visit him. Even weirder to me was how they would ask him for advice on matters big and small, like they could hear him if he was inside. Turns out he was an incredibly influential person in my family. And so I'm curious, are there other cultures with similar beliefs? Well, believe it or not, it turns out there are quite a few. Let's start with the biggest cheese board in Europe, Switzerland. One Swiss village called Schwyz took things so far they built an entire museum dedicated to mummies. Well, not real mummies, of course. Instead, they put up glass cases filled with dolls dressed in period clothing, arranged around little tables. The villagers then invited the spirits of their deceased loved ones to join them for dinner. They might talk to the dolls, asking for advice, or just telling them about their day, and occasionally they even offer up a glass of wine to their tiny guests. Now, at first glance, this may look a bit odd to us, but to the Swiss, this is just a nice way to honor their ancestors and to maintain a sense of community between the living and the dead. But not all corpse conversations are so jolly. In ancient Thebes, if a man died without sons, his widow would participate in something called a funeral marriage. She would shave her head, donning a white shroud like a wedding dress. Then she would lie down in the tomb next to her dead husband. There she would live out the remainder of her days, surviving off offerings from her family until one of her relatives eventually died and could take her back to the land of the living. Now, obviously, this isn't exactly an ideal situation for anyone involved, but this practice was actually meant to show respect to the gods, specifically Hades, the god of the underworld. By marrying her husband in death, the widow ensured her own future, as well as his, which is really just the sweetest thing any partner could do. Then we have the Dogon people of West Africa, who believe that the spirit of the dead lives on within their bodies for at least 1 year after they pass. To prevent the spirit from leaving the body, they would bind up the corpse tightly in a shroud and then store it in the home, usually hanging from the ceiling. Sometimes they would even cover the body with a sort of resin that makes it shine. The reason for this is that the spirit can only travel at night, and so the shiny resin acts as a barrier, preventing the spirit from leaving its vessel. After a year has passed and the body has begun to decompose, they would then take the spirit to a sacred lake, freeing it to move on to the afterlife. Our next stop brings us to a place that should come with a warning label: Las Vegas. In 2006, a man named Victor Munoz called up a local funeral home and requested the body of his recently deceased mother-in-law. At the time, Victor was grieving heavily and wanted to spend one last night with her body. But when the funeral home arrived, they noticed Victor had already cut open the coffin and removed her body. Victor explained that he had planned on keeping her body for longer and asked if they could leave the coffin open so he could stay with her. The funeral home workers, understandably unsettled, agreed to return the next day to collect the body. When they returned, they found Victor in the same position as before. They tried to remove the body, but Victor clung onto the coffin, sobbing that he didn't want them to take her away. Finally, police had to get involved, pulling Victor off the casket and forcing him to accept that his mother-in-law had moved on. Now, you may be thinking that these stories are extreme outliers, examples of people who simply couldn't accept the reality of death. But throughout history, the concept of corpse marriage has appeared all over the world, suggesting that our need to bind ourselves to the dead is hardwired into humanity. Let's travel back to the good old days, the 14th century. This was the era when the Black Plague killed almost half of Europe's population. During such a time, it's understandable that people might cling to their loved ones a little tighter. So naturally, when someone would die, many families would hold on to their bodies as long as possible, sometimes for years. During this time, they would dress the dead as though they were alive, having them sit at the dinner table with the family, or even taking them along on trips. Now, this might sound absolutely vile to us today, but to the people of the Middle Ages, they simply thought that by continuing to care for the body, they were helping the soul reach heaven. Eventually, the church stepped in and created laws against keeping bodies for too long, forcing families to bury their dead after 3 days at the most. However, even that wasn't enough for some, and in some cases, people started to keep their loved ones buried in their homes, making shrines around the coffin. They believed that by doing this, they would be able to communicate with their loved ones, asking for guidance or comfort. Then we have the royal corpse lovers, probably the most disturbing group of all. Back in the Middle Ages, it was common for royalty to keep the bodies of their enemies as trophies, displaying them in public areas like palaces or town squares. They would dress the corpses up in fine clothes, sometimes even putting them on display with a book or scepter, making it clear that the ruler had conquered this person. For example, after Henry VIII defeated his enemies, the Duke of Norfolk and Sir Thomas Bridges, he had their bodies hung in brazen urns on the Tower of London wall. This was done to remind everyone of who was in charge, and to discourage anyone else from trying to challenge him. However, one monarch took this idea to a whole new level: Charles II of Navarre, who ruled in the 14th century. The court of Navarre was famous for its extravagance, but also for its cruelty. One rumour claimed that Charles had a habit of inviting ambassadors from other kingdoms to his court, only to have them mysteriously disappear. Soon after their arrival, guests would attend lavish parties with Charles, drinking and dancing late into the night, but come morning, they would be nowhere to be seen. Many suspected that Charles had actually poisoned these men, but nobody could prove it. What made the story even more disturbing was that Charles was rumoured to have kept the bodies of those he killed at bay, seated upright as if still attending him. The halls of his palace became a theatre of silence, where the dead were his audience, never contradicting, never questioning. Power reflected not in the living who might rebel, but in the lifeless who could never resist. The court chroniclers recorded it quietly, ashamed, not in screams, but in murmurs, as though the shame belonged not only to the king, but to all who bowed before him, pretending not to see. So why exactly do people do this? Why do they tie themselves to the dead? Well, the truth is, there's no single answer. Everyone grieves differently. Some find comfort in remembering, while others prefer to let go quickly. Either way, the way we choose to deal with death is a reflection of our culture, our values, and ultimately our humanity.